Hi, this is Chris Haughey. Thank you for joining me on Create with Chris. Today I will be painting a very unusual and exciting design. This is forest birch trees. I think you're going to absolutely love it. I'm using some really unique techniques and different tools. It's super easy, super fun. Be sure to watch until the end to see how it all comes together. It is totally amazing and impressive. So let's get started. This is an MDF plaque, and the only thing I did was put a little line at the bottom where the horizon line should be. And I'm loading my brush. This is a 3/4 inch oval wash, super soft bristles, loading it with spa blue, just kind of doing a slip slap. I want there to be a lot of movement in the background, so I'm not painting it solid. I want light and dark and different colors. This will take a couple coats, so I'm not worried about being solid, but you can see when I start and stop, I let the edges kind of feather out, so there's no really harsh lines where I stop and start. Blending it together, and just my brush is damp, it's not wet, so I'm still able to move the paint around quite a bit before it starts to tack up. I have a mister that I also use in case I need to extend that open time. I picked up a little bit more spa blue just to kind of keep that a little bit loose, and I did spray it with my mister so you can see how much easier the paint flows on. Doing the same technique, picked up aqua blue, aqua sky, and I started more toward the outer edge and blend it toward the center. I want that center area to be nice and bright, so I'm just floating the color towards the middle, and it's very softly blended. I did wipe my brush if I want to go back in that bright area. Picked up a little bit of gingham blue. This is a newer color, absolutely beautiful. It just really blends nicely with the aquas, and it brings in a little bit of sky color. And I'm putting this more toward the outer edges and blending it in. I sprayed it just a touch more, picked up some dragon teal. This is a stronger, more saturated color. I want the background to look like distant foliage in addition to movement in the sky. I want it to look like there's a forest in the background. As I go toward the bottom, I want it to be darker. I'm doing the close-up of the tree so that the ground will be more toward the bottom. And I picked up a little bit of too much of that aqua sky got into the lighter, so I just went back and picked up some of that spa blue to blend it in. Very, very loose. Allow those brush strokes to be visible. I think that adds another element of interest, and it's always fun to look through these trees like there's much more going on. Okay, this is where it starts to get a little bit interesting. Picked up some soft black, and I'm sliding my palette knife through a very thin puddle of soft black on the palette, and I'm just kind of scrubbing it around. Look at the edges. This you cannot replicate with a brush. This is very textured. I love the results, and it looks like a total mess right now, but it comes together just absolutely beautifully. This is soft black. I'm just pulling it up into that blue. I want this to be the darker area. I have a little puddle of black green, and I'm interspersing it with the soft black, so I don't have just a solid heavy color. So it's just a subtle hint of change of color, and I think it is hard to see on camera, but right here I think it's very noticeable. The soft black has a little bit of purple in it. Black green is very saturated, deep, and rich, and it carries more of those darker green tones to it. So they just marry together very nicely. And look at that top edge. Just let it be loose and kind of random. This takes a little bit of practice. Keeping the palette knife flat is important. Not overloading is also those are probably the two critical factors. And there were a couple of places where I did overload it, and I show you how to fix that. I just ran the side edge of my palette knife into the black green, and I'm just doing some vertical lines just to indicate some tree trunks going on back there. I was going to do more, but I decided what I probably should do at this point is draw in where I want those birch trees. And I did pencil it in, so I kind of knew where their positioning was going to be. Using the chisel edge of my number 12 Fantastic Flat to pull up the trunks of those trees. One thing nice about birch trees, they're pretty much straight, so you don't have to worry about a lot of curves and turns. Now remember, this is just for placement, so once I get these in, I'm not too worried about how solid and heavy. I don't want it to be spotty, but I'm not striving for a super dark base coat on it. This is just for placement. I'm going to be working with the background foliage before I work on the foreground trees. It just makes sense to make sure that they're in there, but I don't want to have to paint the foliage around the trees. So if I get the trees just kind of roughed in, then I know kind of where I'm going to be needing the foliage. And I did just add a little bit of water. That tree's, again, not worried about it being too solid or heavy. And this is where it's really important to keep that palette knife flat on the palette, and I kind of scrub it across to disperse that paint evenly on the bottom. There's just a skim of paint on the palette knife. I don't need to worry so much about getting it onto the trees. So hang in here with me because it looks kind of awful right now, but it's just fascinating the way this all comes together and really works. This is Dragon Teal, and that's one of the darker colors I used in the background. I want this to look like distant foliage, and you can see I didn't, right there, I did not wipe my palette knife clean enough before I put it onto the surface. Not a big deal. I'll show you how to fix that, but keep that in mind. It's easier to be careful than it is to try to go back and fix areas. So I'm just kind of, I just have a hint of paint on my palette knife. Keep it flat on the palette to load it. Keep it flat on the surface to apply it. And it creates this texture that is so unique and interesting. And I found out when I worked in a smaller area on my palette, I had more trouble loading the palette knife. So give yourself plenty of room on the palette to slide that knife through to get enough paint, smooth it out before you apply it to the surface of your painting. And this is just, I think this is so interesting. This is, what color is this? This is black forest green. And there again, I was not patient, but see, I was working on a real little area and I didn't have room to pull my palette knife out nice and smooth. So give yourself plenty of room to work that palette knife before you start applying it to the surface. And what I want to do is build more strength of color toward the bottom. This is going to be the forest floor, so all the foliage toward the bottom is going to be more shaded, but I do want to put this color up around the trees too, just not as heavy or as intense. And I did speed this up a little bit because it's just a little bit here and a little bit there, and get that nice, just kind of randomly add some interest in the background, some little clusters of greenery. This is eucalyptus leaf. This is a really soft, beautiful green. This will be my brighter leaves that come a little bit more forward. get that palette knife cleaned off. I'm trying to be real careful and self-disciplined here. Oh, I think I've got way too much. Yeah, you can see how solid that is. So learn from what I do and not do that. But again, like I said, if that happens, not a big deal. I'll show you how to fix it, and it's an easy fix. But look how beautifully that eucalyptus leaf works with all those other colors. It starts to build that true look of a lot of background foliage going on. There's trees back there, more birch trees. And I love this color family. These are just beautiful shades of green and aquas and blues. And they just, when they're applied over each other, they just build these beautiful monochromatic layers of color that is absolutely gorgeous. So I'm using my palette. I've got another place on the side where I can wipe it off because I was making a mess with getting too much on my palette knife. And it was a simple thing. I just didn't have enough room on my palette to work. So make sure that there's enough room to spread that knife flat. And you can see how many times I reload my palette knife to make sure that I don't overload it and go too fast. A little bit, just often. And that also gives you time to look at it and kind of visualize placement. I know I'm going to have heavier, darker foliage around the big trees. The little trees are a little more distant, so they're not going to be as strong. This is back to that black forest green. It's a little bit shady. Okay, here I'm going to fix that. I went back with my palette knife, picked up some aqua sky, rub it out. I'm going over those clumps, and you can see how it breaks it up. Make sure they're dry, but it'll break it up. And picked up a little bit of that gingham blue, kind of touch it on those areas where there's more of that color in the background. So you can see how simple that is. Just go in and break it up with that little bit of aqua sky. Look at that. It just, like you intended it to be like that all along. It just works out perfectly. And remember, I'm going to paint the trees over top of that, so a lot of that will be covered up. I thought I needed one more little tree in the background, so I'm going in with my number 5 radical round just to add another tree back there. Birch trees usually grow in clusters. And I'm just going back. I've got my radical round and soft black. Went back to my flat. It just takes forever with a tiny brush. Go with brushes that are really going to cover the surface well. Number 12 flat right up there. And my flats are longer in length, so I can add more paint and get a longer stroke than a regular flat. And that gives me a nice, super continuous stroke. I don't have to worry about going back over it and over and over it. The edges are nice and sharp. It has a super sharp chisel edge, so I can go on that chisel edge, and if I need to clean up anything, it's almost like a liner. As I was making my design decisions, I decided that Portobello is a nice earthy color, and it would look really good on the shaded side of the birch trees to pull in a little bit of the brown and still kind of coordinate with all the other colors. But after I put it on, I decided I didn't like the way it looked. I went ahead and put it on the trees just so they'd all be kind of the same. I thought a lot of times as you're working with something, maybe if you work with it a little bit more, you'll end up liking it. So I continued on. I did speed this up because it was, I guess in a way it gives me an idea of the light and dark value. I thought, well, maybe on the front tree it would look better if I used a palette knife. But in the end, with what I did, I don't even think it showed up. But I wanted all the trees to be balanced, so I went ahead and did all of them. If I were to write instructions for this, I probably would omit that because I don't think it lent anything to the overall design. I did pick up a little bit of bleach sand, and you can see I'm sliding the left edge of my palette knife through the puddle of paint, lining it up on the left side of the tree, and I do kind of scooch it up and down and then slide it horizontally across the tree to create that, replicate that birch bark effect. And I'm liking the way this is working out so much better than that portobello. I wanted my trees to really be bright and to be the star of the design. And I just continue on with this bleach sand. When adding design on birch trees, a couple things come into play. Not only the size of the tree, the smaller trees are more black than have the white birch bark, but also the ones in the foreground are going to be much more pronounced. The texture is going to be stronger. And this looks really, really bright right now, but this is the shadow side. And it won't start to look shadowed until the white is applied to the other side. So I apply it kind of vertically, and then I slide the knife horizontally, and that really plays well on the tree. It keeps it a little more natural, and even just kind of tapping it on and pulling it across works well. Obviously, to load the whole flat of the palette knife for these smaller trees is not going to work, so I just kind of play with it on my knife to see how I get the best results. Isn't that amazing? I think the results from the palette knife, truly you cannot replicate with a brush. And again, don't worry about getting over the edge or being too neat or tidy with it, because it all works together. And I was kind of worried at some point that I was kind of lost control. I guess I got excited and applied paint in places it really shouldn't have been. But in the overall scope of it, it truly did work out. So don't try for perfection. Just apply the paint on. Try to be careful. I found out that rushing was probably, I get excited and I want to go a little faster. Here I did pick up a little bit of spa blue to highlight these distant trees. I didn't want them to be as bright as the foreground trees. You know, it makes sense. They're further back, so they're not going to be as strong or as bright, but they still have that little bit of highlight on them. And I kind of use my palette knife almost like a saw, kind of up and down, up and down. I picked up a little bit of that gingham blue to put on the left side, the shaded side of the birch trees. This is Snow White, and this is where it really starts to stand out. So I kept it facing upright, and I'm just applying that Snow White on there. And oh my gosh, this really, like someone flips a switch and turns on. Look how bright it is. And it is rather thick because I want this to be a very strong color. And I do go back a couple times and reinforce that white, because as it dries it gets a little bit less vibrant, which is fine because not all of it needs to be the same intensity. But I'm loving how that looks. It has that almost a shaggy bark texture to it, which is perfect. And it's really working well with those textured leaves in the background. Look how it pushes them back, and all of a sudden you don't really see that in the background. The focus is starting to be on the foreground trees. And I do take my time on this because I want to make sure that those edges are not perfect, but fairly straight. And I load just a little bit on my palette knife on that edge, sharpen that right side, get a little bit more so I can really define that outer edge, and then pull it across. And I did not use any water in this. The paint is thin enough, and most paintings that use palette knives with acrylics use the tube acrylics, which are a lot thicker body paint. So using the palette knife for the bottle acrylics takes just a little more control. Trying to keep the tree background that's kind of showing through the white just a little bit random. I don't want a dark streak up the center. So I'm going back with my palette knife just to kind of give a little more randomness and break up some of those dark areas. While I'm finishing up the texture on the birch bark, I will let you listen to some pretty music. I love how those turned out. I'm just adding some more detail in the background, the hint of more trees back there, a little bit of soft black, just using the side edge of my palette knife, almost like a liner, but using the palette knife, I know I'm going to get more straight lines. Adding another little tree in kind of the offset center, just to fill in that void just a little bit without taking the attention away from the main trees. Pick up a little bit of spa blue to highlight those background trees just a little bit. It's so easy using the palette knife to add that, and it gives that almost a sketch-like. It looks like the sun's just kind of bouncing off some of that textured bark. It's just a really nice effect. And adding some highlights on those trees back there. And look how full the background looks now. It doesn't look so empty. I thought I would add more of the detail on the birch trees with my round, and I picked up some soft black, thinned it down really well, and I figured it would be pretty easy to go in and add that detail, but it was too solid and controlled, and it wasn't giving the effect that I thought it should be. And I'm debating because I really like the way everything's going so far. I was going to take this out, but I thought you might like to see some of my design decisions. I thought maybe I would try with a palette knife. I had so much luck with the birch bark that I went back to the palette knife. Good decision, because 100% better. And I think with the palette knife, you lose that, I don't want to say perfect control, but it becomes just such a natural texture. Look how perfect that works. I love the effect. Now keep in mind we still have some shading and highlighting to do, so This is just adding that more of that texture. And this also helps to pull in more of that, the roundness of the tree, instead of making it look so flat. And there's still a good bit of texture on the tree. It just needed to be enhanced a little bit. So take a look if you're doing this, if you're satisfied with the texture that's on there, maybe more is not needed. Maybe it's too solid and it needs to be added to break it up a little bit more and to increase that texture. This little tree here on the left is very nondescript. Look how it pulls that weight and it gives it more structure. It gives more strength to it. Make sure when you are working on your palette that you have enough fresh paint that you can pull your knife through. If there's not enough on the palette and it's too dry, it can get very frustrating. I love it when just a little bit makes such a big difference, and it's so obvious here that just that little bit of the soft black has really brought those trees to life. This is where I'm going in, and I did let it dry between adding the layers. I don't want to add the black texture over top of the wet white texture. Now I'm just going down. I'm using my 1/2 inch awesome angle with a little bit of soft black, just a hint of soft black, to add some shading on that left side. And I think you can see now why using that portobello in the beginning really didn't make a difference one way or another. This is where the trees, I love soft black when it's thinned down, almost has a purple hue to it. And with this color in the background, it just resonates so well with that soft black as a shade. I want to make sure to separate these trees out right here at the trunk so that definitely one is in front of the other one. And I add the shading on all of the trees except the teeny tiny ones. They don't need it. And on these really small ones, maybe just a little bit. And I'm using mostly water. I don't have much paint on my brush. I can always go back and add more. That's my motto. I can always go back and add more, but to try to take it off and the texture, I'm just so pleased with the way the texture has evolved that I don't want to mess it up. And look how this little bit of shading also straightens up the trees and kind of, if the edges weren't to my satisfaction, it just straightens it up and pulls it in and makes it more, I don't want to say solid, but it makes it more, gives it more strength. And now I've got my radical round. This is a number 2, and I'm adding some branches. Too thick and heavy, so I bumped down to my 18-aught script and soft black, and I'm just adding those small little branches from the trees, and what a world of difference just that little bit of detail makes. And this is kind of fun because the birch trees, the branches go up, they go down. Just make sure that they're strong enough or heavy enough that they show well on the bigger trees. On the little trees in the background, we're just going to kind of pop some in here and there. But this helps pull the whole composition together. And this is just soft black. Want those tips to be nice and thin. It's a little sturdier and heavier toward the trunk of the tree. And as I pull them out, I can let them become a lot finer. Make sure the brush is loaded correctly, that there is enough water in the brush to really make that paint flow off well. Right now I'm kind of struggling, and it's because I don't have enough moisture on my brush. All these decisions. And I don't think there's a bad way to pop these in, and it probably depends too on the background, where they need to be. Every time this is painted, it will always look a little different. And this is the background little branches. I'm just going to kind of pop those in, and you can see how the paint just flows off of the brush. It's because I have quite a bit of moisture in there. I'm not reloading. I don't need to. It's just nice and fluid. And I'm pulling that across in behind. I love how those little branches, sometimes it's the little detail that makes such a big difference on. We've got these big chunky shapes, and adding these little fine lines makes everything look like it was extremely hard to paint. Don't tell anybody it wasn't. I think anybody with any skill level can pull this off quite easily. Want to add just a little bit of highlight on these branches. I started out with spa blue. I thought maybe that would be a good color, but remember we have a lot of spa blue in the background sky, so I need to keep in mind that if I'm using spa blue, that it's not going to blend into the background, kind of makes the branches disappear. Just going back to highlight some of these trees just a little bit more. And I've just picked up a bit of that Snow White on my palette knife, kind of hitting the trees. My favorite word, a little bit here and there. They don't all need to be exactly the same. That's when it becomes boring. And in my mind, I'm kind of thinking where the light's going to hit the trees the strongest. And some of them can be a little more quiet in the background. That's okay. Picked up just a hint of that gingham blue, and I was going to put it in earlier, but it didn't show up. But now that I have all the shading and the highlighting in there, I can add just a touch of it on the shadow side of some of the trees, and it really just adds that next level of interest. Okay, I was going to take this out, but I thought this was another decision. I used the round. I didn't like the way it looked, and I thought I need something big and floppy, so I I stuck my mop in the water basin and dried it on a paper towel, put it in the paint, and it pounced it on my palette, and it opened up, and it created the most beautiful, wonderful texture. Look how I'm smashing it into the paint. It just flops it open. As I'm touching it, I'm rotating the brush. I touch, rotate, touch, rotate. That way it's not creating the same foliage imprint each time I touch down. It's a little bit different. I use the side of it. It's not always perpendicular to the surface. I can pounce it down at an angle. I'm just touching, just barely touching. Birch trees don't have a heavy foliage. I wanted this to be springtime, so the foliage is going to be very light. And I had so much fun just touching this. I was so impressed with how that brush created that foliage texture. I picked up a little bit of Black Forest green on my dirty brush and just popped in some background, a little bit darker foliage. It worked out so well. Look at that. It's just such a beautiful texture. I decided that I would pop it in the foreground with that darker color. I just was so impressed with how beautiful that brush laid in that foliage. So much better than a deerfoot, than a stippler. It's just a fantastic result. I was so excited to share. I did wash my brush out and picked up celery shoot. This is really, really bright. I want to bring that sunshine in. Light touch, very light touch. Don't let this become too overpowering because then it gets boring. Think about where the sun's going to hit. It's not everywhere. We're in a forest, so it's going to be dappled. So I can just pop it in a little bit here and there. And what I normally do is add it here and there over the whole thing, and then stand back and look at it and see where I need to add more, where that sun's going to kind of hone in and create those bright areas. Let it dry, add some more. Not all of it has to be added all at one time. And I did add it until I was satisfied, and then later on I went back and just added a few more pops of bright color because when it dries it does tone down just a little bit. I've not reloaded my brush. I just love that texture. It's so open and so foresty. Look how that just creates that beautiful foreground. And you can see how splayed open the brush is. Just a very gentle touch. I wonder what would happen if I brushed it up like grass and it looks like grass. So I did a few little wispies of, so it looks like a little foliage going on back there. Isn't that beautiful? I was having so much fun, I was kind of worried I would go overboard, but I wanted to bring that brightness down below. There's so much dark area that it needed to be brightened up, but don't kill all the dark areas. Those dark areas need to be there to create contrast. Little touches, just a little touch here and a little touch there. Look at it and see if it's enough. And it looks like I'm laying a lot in there, but it's just such a small amount of paint. Absolutely looks beautiful. I decided at this point I needed some little flowers in there. I didn't want them to be pink, so I went with a lavender. This is, I have to look at the bottles. These are the newer colors, Twilight and Lavender Haze. And I decided to use my incredible comb. I dampened it with water, and then I double loaded it with a little bit of Twilight and Gingham Blue, and I'm just kind of tapping it up. I thought it would look a little like I call them grape hyacinths, just a pretty little forest flower, and bring some color down into all of that at the bottom instead of, it's just a lot of green and blue, and this just brings in a little pop of color. And it's just a very light touch. I'm keeping the brush vertical and just kind of touching up. And it just creates those little clusters of flowers. Don't make it too solid and heavy. It needs to have little areas of flowers, but then areas where it's more open. They're so easy to make, it was kind of fun to get carried away. Picked up just a little bit of that gingham blue to pop in some highlights so they stand out. I thought the flowers on the right should be a little bit brighter than the flowers on the left side. I wanted those to be not as prominent. They're more in the shade. I left that left side be a little bit darker. This is the Lavender Haze. I previously just used the Twilight and the Gingham Blue. Now I'm going to bring in just a little bit of that lavender. And it just brightens them up a little bit more. I love what a difference that little bit of paint makes. And I'm not pushing the brush down. I'm just barely touching the surface. I want, with the Incredible comb, it has these little bristles that are spread apart. So if you barely touch, you get little tiny dots. And that resonates as little tiny buds. So it's just a great way to add those flowers that look like they've been really hand painted. I picked up a little bit of soft black. It's very, very thin, and I'm toning down some of the blue on the trees, going back and just going to add a little more brightness here and there, bring that sunshine in. Just a little bit. It doesn't take much. Take a good look at it and see how it's going. This is where I go back and add some more highlights in the trees. It dried and it's just a little bit dull, so it can go back and it can handle a little more sunshine up there. I have a frame for it. I was trying to decide, should it have a frame on it or should it not? And I decided to go ahead and paint the frame because when I held it up, it just looked awful with the unfinished wood. So I'm using the black green. It's very dark. I don't want to take anything away from the trees. So I'm going to keep that very muted. So I need your opinion. After I get this finished, let me know if you think it should have a frame or it should not have a frame. I kind of like it both ways. I'm good with it without a frame, but then when I put the frame on it, it looks nice as well. So let me know what you think. All the supplies I used are listed in the description below. I hope you learned some new tips, tricks, and techniques. I think this project was totally fascinating. I was super excited to share it. I hope you give it a try, and if you do, I would love to see what you do. Send me a picture. I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope you had as much fun as I did. I look forward to our next painting adventure together. And remember, a little bit of paint makes a big difference.